We continue today with the prophetic writing series. We're dealing with the book Jewish Apocalypticism, and we're dealing with the book of Daniel. In our research, we found that there were three main writers to the book of Daniel, and we'll give the evidence for that as we go through each of them. The first writer wrote during the time of the Babylonian captivity from about 597 to 538 BC. The second wrote during the time of Abomination of Desolation, 167 to 164 BC. And the third writer, we've located him early in the 2nd century AD. He wrote the last set of editions, and sometime after his writing, this book was translated back into the Tanakh. And there's evidence for that, support for that in the Jewish Encyclopedia. Look under Daniel, or look under Theodotion, you'll see it there. Right, the reason we state that the first writer wrote folk stories into Daniel, we see in Ezekiel 14:14 speaks of Noah, Daniel, and Job, and these characters became largely known from the time of the captivity, and we show that in the beginnings as well, that Noah was created during the Babylonian captivity, and the other works also became popular from that time. Ezekiel 28:1 speaks of Daniel and asks the question whether any secret is a match for you, relating to the dream that he interpreted in Nebuchadnezzar when he had that dream. And then we also see in 1 Maccabees 2:59, and it's very significant that during that time, in that text, they mentioned the three saved out of the fire and Daniel delivered from the mouth of lions. So we see the folk story elements being mentioned here. And it's significant in that the Maccabees were at war with Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes was the main character of the second writers' additions to Daniel. But here, early on, they don't mention that. And the fact that they don't mention this at all shows that those sections weren't in the book at that time. And Josephus tells us that Daniel spoke of the attack by Antiochus Epiphanes, and does not speak of the abomination of desolation as a future event. So that supports the idea that this wasn't written earlier on into this book of Daniel that contained folk stories. Also, the fact that Daniel was placed into the Ketuvim, the writings, with Esther, as this wasn't a prophetic work, it didn't carry prophetic elements. And we see that Daniel has parallels with Joseph in prison without cause, interpreted dreams, and elevated to a top position in the country. So we see those kind of works were written to encourage the people during difficult times and to give them hope. And that was the intention of the first writer of Daniel that wrote folk stories. And we see that the first writer, we've located the chapters written by him, chapter 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 9, 1 to 19. And the reason we include 9, 1 to 19, it's the prayer of Daniel. And after hearing about the attacks and the horrible time that the people are going to go through, in chapters 7 and 8, we see that Daniel doesn't pray at all for that persecution, but his prayer indicates that it belonged to the first writer's writings. So we see that's the evidence for the first writer of Daniel. And then the second writer to Daniel was written during the time of the Abomination of Desolation, 167 BC to 164. And they believed that the kingdom of God would be ushered in at the fourth beast's demise. And we see, as the writer writes, he writes and he quotes certain passages from Ezekiel. And we mention that in the book. We do a verse-by-verse commentary on the book, and we show clearly where they get their various things from. And the writer at that time believed that this was a fulfillment of Ezekiel, and that at his demise, the kingdom of God would be ushered in. And we see, for instance, the detail of the history given. We do a full verse-by-verse commentary on chapter 11, and we show the intricate details of the history. And we show clearly that this overshadows the normal type of bona fide prophecy in terms of the amount of detail given about Antiochus Epiphanes and the 6 wars, the 6 Syrian wars, and various mentioning of Rome. The consul comes to Egypt to prevent Antiochus Epiphanes from entering in, and the wars in the north Seleucids had in Macedonia, and the Romans were involved there, and all those aspects are mentioned, and we mention that in the book. And in Daniel, it mentions the 10 kings leading up to the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, and we give the actual 10 kings before Antiochus, and it's exactly what actually happened. And then Daniel 7:8 speaks about the little horn pulling out the 3 horns by the roots, and uttered great boast. And we show clearly that, first of all, he usurped the throne from Heliodorus, and then took the throne from the rightful heir, Demetrius I Soter, and then had his co-regent, Antiochus, a younger son of Seleucus, murdered. So those were the 3 roots that he pulled out. And then the great boasts is as a result of him calling himself Theos Epiphanes, the manifest God. And actually on the cover of the book, Jewish Apocalypticism, we have we show the coin minted by Antiochus, both sides of the coin, with the inscription of himself as Theos Epiphanes, and he believed himself to be the visible manifestation of Zeus. And in this coin depiction, he's got his hand stretched out with actually Nike sitting on his hand, Nike there, victory, the goddess of victory, showing that he was victorious over all of his enemies. And we also see that early writers also stated that much of Daniel was written during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and that was Porphyry, a Greek Neoplatonic philosopher, 234 to 305 AD. So a lot of people have actually mentioned this and seen this, and a lot of writers have written about that. Now, the second writer, he wrote chapters 2, 7, 8, 10, and 11. And he used much of Enoch in the imagery of Enoch in his writings. And we see this displayed in the kingdoms being shown through various metals. And Enoch does that on various occasions. Yeah, they speak of the 3 metal mountains depicting empires. And then he also depicts archangels in Daniel, and they seem to be controlling the nations and warring against nations. And we see those archangels are depicted in the book of Enoch. Michael and Gabriel and the other 5 archangels are mentioned there. And the fact that they defend nations, and the type is also shown in other apocalyptic writings, and we quote that in the book. And then also Daniel has 3 sets of occurrences. They have 3 descriptions of the 4 empires, and showing these accounts in sets of 3 started in Enoch. They've got 3 metal mountains, 3 flood accounts, 3 judgments, and we state that in the book. And we also show the heavenly court of Daniel 26 is styled on Enoch 46, 1-4 and 47, 3. And we see that displayed there. What also we noted that the second writer, he wrote of the time and half a time, the 3.5 years. And that time and half a time related to the full event of the initial warring against the Israelites, and then for 3 years was the Abomination of Desolation that lasted for exactly 3 years, as mentioned by Josephus, and so we see that period is a combination of the earlier fight attacking of the Israelites, and then the Abomination of Desolation for 3 years. And now Trypho the Jew, it was interesting, we were searching through various things, and Trypho the Jew came up in terms of the time and half a time. And Justin Martyr, if you look in the early church fathers, the dialogue with Trypho the Jew. And Trypho likened the time and half a time to 350 years. And the fact that he dated it from the time of the Abomination of Desolation, and of course Justin Martyr was about 140 AD, so if you add 140 and 167, you get about 300 and something years. So they anticipated this being fulfilled within the next short while. And they did not relate this back to the instruction given to rebuild the city. So we see they were still operating under the Tanakh version, and the Tanakh version was times and half a time, and didn't mention any of the additions yet by the third writer. So the vision of 70 weeks was not yet in their copy, and that's why they related this time to 350 years. We also mentioned there that the 2,300 evenings and mornings mentioned in Daniel 7:14 was originally shown as 3.5 years, 1296 days by the second writer, and that the third writer changed that to show from the time 6.3 years from the time that the high priest was sold off to the highest bidder until such time as the end of the Abomination of Desolation. But the original figure there would have been 1296, as stated by Josephus, and we mentioned that in the book. Now, the third writer, we were looking for a candidate. We needed someone that lived between 90 and 140 AD. We used 90 because Josephus wrote extensively on Daniel, but never mentioned the vision of 70 weeks. He also didn't see the Abomination of Desolation as a future event. So it was from 90 AD to 140 AD. That's the time that Justin Martyr refers to the book of Revelation. And we know that Daniel was contained, the third writer's additions were contained in the Revelation in terms of the vision of 70 weeks. So it had to be between 90 and 140 AD when this was actually done. And he required a Christian background because he writes of Messiah being cut off in the 69th week. He needed to know Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek because he translated that back into Greek, from Greek back into the Tanakh, and so he needed to know those languages. Also, he would have needed to have an interest in the apocalyptic. He needed to know the Tanakh and have insight into Christianity. We looked at various people for this candidate, and we first thought it was this one or that one, but eventually all the pointers pointed to Aquila of Sinope, who lived from about 70 to 140 AD. He was initially a Christian who was eventually excommunicated from the church for his observance of astrology, calculated his horoscope each day. He tried to justify himself by saying this is in terms of fate, as the Pharisees believed, but the church had none of that and excommunicated him, and he became a Jewish proselyte. He was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, ben Yosef Akiva, and he busied himself with translating the Tanakh into Greek and updating various apocalyptic writings, and we've got all the quotes for that in there. There was a book written by James Elmer Dean called Epiphanius, Treatise on Weights and Measures. One can Google that and see. And Epiphanius speaks of Aquila of Sinope, and he mentions that he didn't believe in the deity of Messiah. He believed he was a natural son of Joseph, and speaks of his astrology and various things, his excommunication. And also an interesting fact, he says he wanted to show that Yeshua was the Messiah and wanted to show that this related to the Tanakh and various writings, as he felt ashamed of himself for being excommunicated from the church. So we see Daniel is in the book of Daniel, it speaks of Messiah being cut off in the 69th week, and it also speaks of the fourth man in the fire, and we see that's him trying to show Messiah as the supported in the Tanakh. So we see that came to pass there. He still believed in Messiah, although he didn't believe that Messiah was the Son of God. He wasn't divine in his origination. Origen wrote his Hexapla, and that was 6 versions of the biblical account, and we show that clearly. The 6 versions, a Hebrew text, that's the Old Tanakh. Secondly, Hebrew in Greek characters, a transliteration of the Hebrew. And third, the Greek version by Aquila that operated early in the 1st century 2nd century AD, and then a Greek text by Symmachus the Ebionite from about 160 AD, and 5th was the Septuagint with annotations from Theodosian's Greek text, and then number 6 was a Greek text by Theodosian who operated about 180 AD. And in his various writings, Origen writes this letter to Africanus, and he discusses the book of Daniel. And he speaks about the various versions, and of course the Greek copies usually contain the 3 additional stories, Susanna, Bell and the Dragon, Prayer of Azariah, and the Song of the 3 Children. And he mentions that the difference between the Old Tanakh and these latest versions with the extra verses was some 200 verses difference between the two. And we drew up a number of the verses. Susanna was 63, Bell and the Dragon 42, the Prayer of Azariah and the 3 Children, that's 68 verses. And then we put our additions in that Aquila did. Daniel 7, 6 verses, Daniel 9, 8 verses, and Daniel 12, 13 verses. And it came to precisely 200 verses. And this shows us clearly that there was a difference, and it shows us that it was written after the AD 70, and that it related to these updates by Aquila. So we also show clearly that Aquila's additions are not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in actual fact, when we did a study of that, we put all the differences and the big gaps where and it's mentioned in the book, the big gaps where Aquila's additions go in Daniel 7, Daniel 9, and of course Daniel 12. And we show that it did not appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these were additions after AD 70. And secondly, Josephus, that writes extensively on Daniel, doesn't mention any of these additions that were made by Aquila. And of course, the early church didn't preach. This would have been a golden opportunity, because Aquila, in his editions, the vision of 70 weeks, he supports Paul's times of the Gentiles and various things. And this is actually what he was doing. He was supporting all of these things and in his writing. But of course, none of the early church actually preach on that. And of course, we also show 1947, an ancient scroll of Daniel was handed in by Bedouins to CIA operative Miles Copeland in Damascus, and he photographed this old scroll. And this old scroll would have been dating back to about the Dead Sea Scroll time. And he sent it off, and he was told when he inquired about this that he needn't bother himself about this. It was the old scroll of Daniel, and that scroll never saw the light of day until this time. But it's probably still with the CIA, and that would show exactly what I'm saying is true, and that these were additions by the third writer. Now, the third writer's additions are largely the judgment scene in Daniel 7, 9 to 10, and that's taken directly from Enoch 14, 18 to 23. The wording is the same. It's precisely taken from there. Daniel 7, 12 gives the fourth beast an extension of life. You see, the old Daniel, the kingdom of God was meant to be ushered in with the demise of Antiochus Epiphanes, but it never occurred. So he gave this beast an extension of life out into the future. And we show in Revelation how he changed the meaning of certain texts and things. And then 7:13 to 14, he has the Son of Man presented before the Ancient of Days, and that's taken from Enoch 48, 2 to 6. And the vision of 70 weeks we show clearly, and that's in Daniel 9, 24, is taken from Enoch 10, 11 to 14. And in Enoch it states that the fallen angels were taken and bound and put into the crevice on the earth, and they were going to be left there for 70 generations until the consummation, and then they would have been judged and then cast into the lake of fire. And what he did, he took that 70 weeks and he coupled it with other portions in Enoch, the vision of the weeks, the vision of weeks, and he made it 70 weeks, and he took the 69 weeks on Messiah's crucifixion and dated this thing back, and he found out that the date was more or less the date when the instruction was given to build Jerusalem. Probably would have been more significant if it dated back to the rebuilding of the temple, but that date wouldn't have tallied. So he took that date and he calculated and worked it out. We also show evidence in there from the Royal Observatory that with the full moons and the various things that take place, that it didn't relate precisely to that 69-week period. So we show that over there. Also, the third writer to Daniel shows Messiah being cut off in the 69th week, and that's ex post facto. And he mentions there that people of the prince will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and then will be war and desolations are determined. And he's writing that ex post facto and combining it with the end time signs that were given at the end of the age, that were given by Messiah. So we see that clearly. And so we see also in Daniel 12, the writer in 12:2-3 mentions the dead rising out of the dust of the earth and shining like the firmament. And we see that's a Zoroastrian concept, and many writers have written of that. And we show clearly that Aquila of Sinope came from an area that was previously in the Achaemenid Empire, and he would have grown up with these Zoroastrian concepts, and that's why he includes this here. One of the other things he did, he speaks in the 12th chapter of 1,290 days, which is the 3.5 years, and then he mentions 1,335 days, and we researched this, and it refers to the feast of Tu Bishvat, roughly 45 days after Hanukkah, and the date on which trees were aged for fruit tithing purposes, when new fruit was eaten. And he's referring this to the new Jerusalem and the new fruit that will be eaten there. And we show this as part of the apocalyptic intrigue, and they wrote it in this way so people could search and look, and they had the satisfaction of actually working these things out. But we show this is all ex post facto and speculation that's taken place. We show that the third writer also wrote the book of Revelation, and the time gap between the third editions and the when Revelations was known is a very small window. It's about 20 years, and the fact that the third writer's editions, the vision of 70 weeks, is mentioned in Revelation shows that Aquila of Sinope was the author to that. We also show inside Revelation that he depicts Messiah as an angel on about 6 occasions because he did not believe in the deity of Messiah. And at the end he has John worshipping the angel, and then the voice of the angel changes to Messiah, and we see clearly he's trying to show, and he says, do not worship angels, worship God. He's trying to give a message to the church not to worship Messiah, but to worship God. So we see that he was the writer of Revelations. We show other evidence there. We speak about Revelation 12:1-3, and Aquila was into astrology and all the constellations and everything. And in Revelations 12:1-3, he mentions the Israel and the sun and the moon and the stars above her head, the 12 stars, and we show that was Benice's. There's a constellation named after Benice, and there's also Draco the dragon, and all those things are mentioned there, showing that it was Aquila of Sinope that wrote this. And also he mentions the devil falling with a third of the angels, which relates to the Sumerian trinity of Anu, Enlil, and Ea or Enki. And they all had power to create their own angels. And of course, Enki fell, and he would have fallen with a third of the angels. And that's where that comes from. So we show there that various, I've got the quotes there here where he talks of Messiah as an angel. He alludes to Messiah as an angel, and that's Revelations 1:13-17, one like a son of man, and he compares it to the angel in Daniel 10:56. And Revelations 10:1, he depicts Messiah as an angel with an appearance as Messiah in Revelations 1:12-18, and shows him with the rainbow above his head, linking him with Ezekiel 1:28. Revelations 14:14-15, one like a son of man. Revelations 18:1, angel illumined with glory, styled on the angel in Ezekiel 43:1-7, with the glory of God returning to the temple, and that he depicts Messiah as that. And then he also states Messiah, or he states the angel who is like the Son of Man, having a golden crown on his head, and depicts Messiah as an angel who is instructed by another angel to reap the earth Revelations 14:14 to 16, and then has those passages where John purportedly worships the angel, Revelations 19:10 and 22:6 to 9. So we see the book of Daniel has got its issues. We show clearly that Daniel was written by 3 writers, and all of the texts and all of the supporting evidence is given in various quotes. So one can see that clearly. It's ex post facto, and that Daniel was carried over into Revelation shows that the corruption went from there into Revelation, and we show clearly that the book of Revelation is a depiction of all the tenets of Jewish apocalypticism, and that there's nothing much new in there, but it was someone placing all the apocalyptic expectations from the various writings in one work, and we show that that was written by Aquila of Sinope. So this is the end of this particular podcast. Remember, these books are available on Amazon.com and bookbaby.com. Just do a search under Ernest Austin Adams. Thank you for watching.